A massive fine, one of the biggest fines in technology for EU history, but the first one against Apple.
Right, and just to put this in context here, this is a $2 billion U.S. fine, 1.8 in euros. But you also got to look at what's coming later this week, Dom, and that is the Digital Markets Act in Europe is going into full effect. That puts at risk 10% of annual global revenue from these companies. For Apple, that would be about $40 billion with a B. So if you think the $2 billion fine is a lot, take a look at what's potentially here if they break the rules that are going to go in effect later. Since this broke this morning, we actually finally did hear from Spotify. Spotify is the company that started this complaint against Apple. It's the same arguments that we've been hearing for so long, what they characterize as unfair fees for in-app transactions and so forth. And of course, the EU side with them. And Spotify's CEO, Daniel Ek, basically saying, you know, this is a win for them, but they don't believe Apple is going to necessarily comply. And he points to some kind of he layers a lot of skepticism in here, let's call it. He points to some actions Apple has taken when these regulatory things happen, how Apple finds ways kind of around it, which in fact they're going to do at the DMA. So he talked a lot about that. Apple's side of the thing is, by the way, they are appealing, so this is not a done deal yet. And Apple saying, you know, Spotify wouldn't be the market leader in streaming music if it wasn't for the iPhone. And then you have Spotify saying the iPhone wouldn't be the iPhone if it wasn't for developers like us making it appetizing for people to go out there and buy. So, you know, this is going to be a huge case that will also have effects of what we see here in the U.S. because we're expecting the antitrust lawsuit from the DOJ against Apple to drop any day now over very similar items. So this is a big, beefy case going on.
It's also interesting, too, because, you know, the way that Apple frames it, they're not wrong that the install base for iOS is one of the main reasons why many of these apps get the traction that they do. What's kind of ironic is Apple also points out, again, this is from their kind of statement, that Spotify currently has around 56% of the European streaming music market already. So what they're kind of hinting at is that Spotify is alleging antitrust behavior when Spotify itself is the kind of antitrust guy when it comes to music streaming in Europe. How exactly does the next chapter play out in this appeal process then?
That is to be determined. So they are going to appeal. But more interesting is the DMA process going to play out because Apple a few weeks ago, they put out these rules. And again, it's very similar to the things that were laid out in this case about in-app payments and the like. Apple laid out its idea for compliance with the Europeans' new rules. We don't know, Apple doesn't know if those ideas are actually going to fit the letter of the law that the EC is looking for. So what the real next shoe to drop is when the EC sees these practices in action, do they, start investigating right away? Do they start looking at Apple and saying, you know, we might fine you that 10% of your global revenue if you don't change X, Y, and Z in your policies because we don't believe it matches the letter of the law. So that is the risk right there. And Apple, of course, is making all kinds of arguments against that, saying, you know, it puts security at risk of our users and by letting, you know, these outside apps go on phones. Same arguments they've been making forever, but we're going to see it in practice very soon, just a matter of days.